Sir Walter Raleigh writes, "Give me my scallop shell of quiet, my staff of faith to walk upon, my scrip of joy, immortal diet, my bottle of salvation, my gown of glory, hope's true gauge, and thus I'll take my pilgrimage." I'm wearing my scallop shell around my neck. This is a symbol of pilgrims who have walked the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. And I brought back with me not many things because I had to carry everything. So I didn't want to bring a whole lot with me, but we can do show and tell after the service. I brought back with me a lot of brick and mortar kind of pieces, pieces of tile that had been softened by the waves in Finisterre. So the main route of the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, known as the Camino Francés, oh, and you'll see my pictures behind me as I talk. It's known as the Camino Francés, and it stretches 800 kilometers, a full 500 miles across northern Spain, from the tiny touristy French border town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port to the rambling city of Santiago and beyond to the end of the world, known as Finisterre. It's said that the cathedral in Santiago is the resting place for the reliquary of the saint himself, his 84 recovered bones resting in a silvered casket several feet under the floor of the cathedral. And pilgrims are invited to make their way down the marble stairs and, in their turn, say a prayer for the protections of the saint. People from all over the world for thousands of years have walked to this place for this purpose. And earlier this summer, I was one of them. Now, people choose to walk the Camino for a variety of reasons. Some as penance or as a way to reflect, some as exercise or as a prayer in honor of loved ones they've lost, in honor of the life they want to be living, in honor of God. My very secular American self decided to walk the Camino about 4 years ago, actually, after watching the movie The Way. The Way stars Martin Sheen, and it was directed by his son, Emilio Estevez. I'd never heard of the Camino before, but by the end of the movie, I knew that I wanted to walk it. I told my husband as much as the credits were rolling, and he said very lovingly and very laughingly to me, "You want to do all the things." And that is true. Like many of us, I often jump in with both feet and then look up to wonder, just how did I get myself into this? But this adventure really appealed to my sense of living a simple life. Pilgrims walk all day, but they get to stop at cafes and drink café con leche. They get to take showers at night and sleep in clean bunk beds. As a tour across Europe, it's also relatively inexpensive, relatively safe, and relatively challenging. I knew at once that once my kid had graduated high school and was safely launched in his young adult life, that I wanted to take some time to reimagine myself. I started dreaming of my Camino. Now, historically, women are not the ones who are taking this kind of pilgrimage, this arduous journey to Santiago. In the old days, the path was notably dangerous, and then, as now, women had to be particularly wary. Bandits roamed the hills and valleys, waiting to steal a pilgrim's money and food, and sometimes his life. At one point in history, Templar knights were deployed to protect pilgrims along the way from bandits and from wild dogs that also roamed the hills. Today, there are no bandits or wild dogs, I'm happy to report, unless you count the untethered terrier that scared the heck out of me when he jumped out at me from behind his gate post one evening. It scared me half to death, but he didn't do anything more dangerous than barking. Today, equal numbers of men and women walk the way in all kinds of configurations, as couples, as parent-child teams, as large organized groups, or like me, as a lone pilgrim. I actually went on the Camino to be alone, but with so many pilgrims along the way, alone time could be hard to come by. Hundreds of thousands of people walk this route each year, although at the height of the Camino in the medieval times, that number was doubled. So we have a long history. Many modern pilgrims walk the Camino because of their Catholic faith. Juxtaposing that faith against my own Unitarian Universalist faith was fascinating for me, and I admit that I was a bit jealous of the beauty that ancient believers have created all across the landscape in Spain. Huge, soaring cathedrals and these tiny, heavy stone churches, just beautiful. All of it was beautiful and a bit strange compared to our more modern sanctuary. I deliberately entered into many conversations with other pilgrims along the way about the nature of faith, theirs and mine. Many had not heard about Unitarian Universalism, but many had. Because St. James wears two faces, the saint that we walk for, he wears two faces. He wears that of the original pilgrim roaming the land in Spain and spreading the word of Jesus. And then there's this later version that was overlaid on him from the Catholic Church, using him as a symbol to mount a war and drive out the Moors from Spain. So you'll see both of those images all across Spain. It made me think of our own tradition, which, however imperfect it might be, is built on an entirely different foundation. King Sigismund, the first and only Unitarian king, who ruled over Transylvania in the 1400s, he issued the Edict of Torda during his time, the first of its kind, allowing for the people of Transylvania to practice their own religion and to practice their own beliefs. You might say that this tradition of acceptance is written into the DNA of our Unitarian Universalism. In walking across Spain, I grew to understand just how uniquely poised we are to be a healing faith for people in our time. Our tradition is one of holy curiosity, acceptance, and a striving for justice. In other words, inquisitiveness, not inquisitions. And I think that's something to be very deeply proud of. I'm gonna breathe a little bit. The way charges across Spain, like blood coursing through a vein, as vital and as life-giving. It's said that the way follows the paths of ley lines, earthly life forces that ancient Celtic, pagan, and Druidic people tapped into as a regular source of renewal. Today, there's an area of Galicia where red-headed Spaniards are seen everywhere. They're very common. And Celtic music, including bagpipes, it's heard everywhere in this part of Spain, in Galicia and further west in Finisterre. Above the ley line crossing Spain stretches the Milky Way. When walking in the early morning before first light, a pilgrim can look up from the path, turn off her headlamp, and if she's sufficiently far enough outside a city or village, can see the whole galaxy spread out above her. Being made of stardust is never more believable than when looking up at that beauty in evidence overhead. I went seeking some sense of calm, and I found it sometimes along the way. Sometimes I didn't. Sometimes my feet really hurt. Actually, a lot of the time, my feet really hurt. And in those times, I would distract myself by singing. Sometimes I would sing, or often I would sing, actually, "May I be filled with loving kindness. May I be well. May I be filled with loving kindness. May I be well. May I be peaceful and at ease. May I be whole." Other times I would sing a song that I made up for myself. "I can do this, I'm not gonna die." So, take your pick. Pumping the arms is really important when you're singing that second song. So yeah, it was really hard on my feet. And also my head felt mostly clear and my heart mostly felt light. And the beauty of all things was very close to me along the way. I had an opportunity to think about and write about new life. Oh no, I had an opportunity to think about and write about and pray about the big questions of my life. how to be of service, how to build a new life out of all of the changes and transitions we've been facing, how to say goodbye and feel the grief of the life I used to have, how to be an effective parent to our children, biological, and those from my partner's first marriage, how to keep the focus on myself while also showing up for the people that I love, how to ask for what I need, how to communicate when we don't share a language and how to communicate when we do. There are sayings that spring up all along the Camino, things that everyone will hear and repeat to themselves and to one another along the way. The first of these is Buen Camino. I'd like to hear you guys say it. Buen Camino. Buen Camino. Loosely translated, it means something like blessings on your way. You hear this up and down the path as you pass other pilgrims or they pass you, and from folks in the cities and villages who see you walking from a distance into town with your pack on your back. It's as ubiquitous as good morning. But as a spiritual discipline for myself, I tried to remember to hear it and say it as thousands of tiny prayers, blessing each pilgrim's journey, blessing my journey. Before I left for my Camino, I could not imagine what it would be like to actually be there day after day, walking with myself and with an invitation in my heart for God or the universe or the great mystery to join with me. I think that deep mystery did join me and help me along the way, mostly in the form of other pilgrims, but sometimes in some really supernatural stuff. I mean, pilgrims are people. There are some you connect with and some you don't. Some who are healthy and some who aren't, some who push your buttons and some who make you shake with mirth. But they are all mirrors for you, and that is a huge blessing and a wonder. I got to meet so many pilgrims and spend time walking, talking, eating, sleeping, taking care of our feet, resting. The Camino reminds you, if you were perhaps in doubt, that people are, as a whole, absolutely wonderful. And we take care of one another in big ways and small. I'm going to share one example of this taking care. It happened on my very first day. I started to develop a hot spot on my foot. And so I stepped to the side of the path and I pulled off my boots and my socks and I was rummaging through my pack to try to find my own first aid kit. And this young woman stopped and she pulled out what looked like an entire pharmaceutical warehouse. She just had absolutely everything. And she handed me some Compeed and then some extra Compeed and some Band-Aids. And if you ever go on the Camino, you will develop your own opinions about whether or not the use of Compeed is a good idea. But on that very first day, I was so grateful to be taken care of in this way. Someone was so kind as to stop their own journey and to help me along mine. And it turns out that this woman who had pulled out this pharmaceutical warehouse, she was a really good scout, and she ended up becoming a really great friend along the way. I got to learn her stories. We walked together for several days, and so I'm going to share it with you. She said that was okay. In her former life, Raga had been a mountaineer leading expeditions up the sides of various mountains in India. Originally from Finland, she had married a man from India, and together they literally climbed mountains for a living for several years before she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer. When I met her, she was in remission after having undergone 2 rounds of chemo and 2 rounds of radiation. She was walking the Camino to build her strength back up, proving to herself that her body could still do what she asked of it. I saw a picture of her on Facebook at the end of her Camino. I had arrived days before her and was already home when the notification came through. But in the picture, she is practically floating. She's standing in front of the cathedral and she is just so happy. She has the most brilliant smile on her sweaty, sunburned, absolutely radiant face. I'm really very humbled and proud to have been a witness to that part of her journey. And to be able to share my story with her. All right, so another thing that you hear along the way is everyone must walk their own Camino, which basically means that we are all there for different reasons, with different intentions, and different ways of approaching our life journeys. What works for one pilgrim may not be right for another. It is a reminder not to judge one another. We are all walking miles upon miles in our shoes. I think the focal point for me was the reality that going around the world and walking 500 miles did not remove my insecurities or my idiosyncrasies or the things that bug me about being me from me. They didn't remove any of those things. It did, however, allow me to come face to face with them. And it gave me an opening to choose different ways of coping with these aspects of myself. Honoring myself above what I thought other people wanted of me became a cornerstone of my Camino. Sometimes I did it really well. Sometimes it was completely imperfect or a total mess. Sometimes I just failed to see where I was putting other people and their expectations, or what I thought were their expectations, above my own self. I know that I cannot be alone in this struggle of people pleasing. I had plenty of opportunities to practice listening to myself first while I was on the way, and I very highly recommend it. The Persian poet Rumi does too. He reminds us, "The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep." People are going back and forth across the doorsill where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. It's been difficult for me not to go back to sleep. The world that we live in is rushing all the time. The information and expectations and demands pulling us in every direction are very difficult to ignore. I took to calling what I experienced on my Camino moving at human speed. I didn't use my phone for much of anything other than calling home to my family, which was wonderful. And as an alarm for early mornings when I wanted to get up and walk under the Milky Way, and as the occasional sound buffer for walking near major highways when I would listen to Jim Dale read chapters of Harry Potter to me. I walked everywhere I wanted to go and took in parts of the world that constantly get missed when traveling in a car. I rested when I needed to rest, stopping by the side of the trail in the shade of an olive tree, for example, or sitting on a roughly carved wooden seat made for the very purpose of allowing pilgrims a place to rest. I ate when I needed to eat, either stopping at a cafe or munching on leftovers from the night before. Pilgrims are constantly squirreling away food into their backpacks for later. Moving at human speed means slowing down. How many times do we just react to what's happening in front of us because it is the biggest or the loudest or the most alarming thing we see? But our lives actually grow more full when we take more time for ourselves and fill our time with less. I know it. I experienced it. Another saying you hear up and down the way is that when the walking stops, your true Camino begins. I've been thinking about this a lot recently. It's been several months since I returned from my journey, and at times I feel more agitated, more close to tears than I did before I left. I'm beginning to think that's a good thing. I don't know. I'm beginning to think that's my life force telling me to pay attention to the lessons of my Camino and to keep moving at human speed, no matter what. Several weeks after I got home, a news article made the rounds on the Camino Facebook communities I'm a part of. Someone had graffitied the newly restored cathedral in Santiago. In fact, I saw a really surprising amount of graffiti on the sides of churches and cathedrals, which made me think to myself on more than one occasion that people are people everywhere you go, and that nothing, and I mean nothing, is sacred, which can also mean then that everything is sacred. The sadness I felt when I saw the image of St. James defaced by blue spray paint made to look like a member of the band Kiss. That's how they spray painted him. Yeah. It was equal to the revelatory feeling of cresting the hillside and seeing that cathedral for the first time in the distance, or the expansive feeling of standing at the top of the cathedral on my tour there, looking out over the city of Santiago, hearing the bagpipes floating up through the air and seeing the pilgrims posing in front of the cathedral just as I had done a few days before. I think that I may be learning to be grateful for all of it, the mundane and the divine, the beautiful and the ugly, because our lives are made up of those contrasts and because we can't experience one without the other. I'm certain that this juxtaposition is always present in our lives. It can be easy to get discouraged by the graffiti, but on the way, the spray-painted arrows, on the roads, on the sides of buildings, on fence posts, and yes, on the sides of churches, and on stones in the forests, they weren't graffiti, they were guideposts. Now, when I'm out walking in Eugene, moving at human speed, as it were, I look for the arrows. It's kind of a fun practice, not unlike playing the alphabet game on a long car ride. And it serves to keep you present in the moment, or it does for me anyway. I encourage you to go ahead and try it. Next time you're out for a walk, just look for the arrows, and you get double points if you then turn the way that they're pointing and just follow them. They're my proof that the Camino is still with me and still guiding my way on. All right, so I'm going to have to end today with a list. This is a list of things I wanted to tell you about my pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago de Compostela. Write about starting out. Write about Finisterre. Write about arrows. Write about helping tying hay on the front of the tractor. Write about the green tree. Write about seeing everyone in Santiago that you didn't see the last week or two of your walk. Write about Doris. Write about a strengthening faith in Unitarian Universalism, a tradition of radical inclusion, open questioning, and acceptance. Write about arriving in Santiago on San Juan Day and jumping over the bonfire for luck in the coming year, and eating sardines and listening to Buena Vista Social Club music as played by a live band and trying to dance salsa. Write about loving people. So, listen, I walked for a really long time. There are too many things to tell you. There's no way I would have been able to do it all in this short amount of time, or even in a day of telling. I walked for 5 weeks, and I imagine it would take just as long to tell you all of the moments and all of the ups and downs of that journey in that amount of time. It would just take that much time. But this last point, this one about loving people, it's the crux of all of it, I think. The Camino is like living a life distilled, and at the heart of it is the love you share along the way. Meeting people, hearing their stories, sharing your own story, finding places of commonality, finding soul siblings, and recognizing them as your own. This love is what makes the Camino so meaningful. Indeed, it's what makes a life meaningful. I want to thank you all for your love of me. You made it possible for me to go on this journey. You gave me a foundation to leave from and a soft place to come home to. I am so very grateful. Thank you.